Welcome to the third and final part of our video series looking at the India and Chinese synoptic materials. This one's going to be looking very much at the future, and in particular we're going to try and think about two possible questions that could come up. So the first one is about the threats and opportunities facing India and China's growth. The second one, I actually think, having looked at the materials again, is probably slightly more likely, is a question about why future economic growth of India and or China is hard to predict. Now, when we're looking at these issues, there's a whole host of things we need to consider. Obviously, the main one is going to be economic factors, but we'll also have a look at economic policy, some of the social issues, particularly surrounding India, energy, water security, and other synoptic issues like that. Demographics will come into this. We need to look at internal and external conflict, and again, being synoptic, we can't forget climate change and perhaps some other natural disasters that could come into this. Now, it's worth starting then to have a look at the economic factors, and in particular if we're thinking about this question. Now, the reason why I think a question about why it's hard to predict future economic growth is quite likely comes from having a look at these two bits of the resources. And if you have a look, okay, it's this bit here, just have a read through it. Predicting the future size economies is very difficult. Doesn't actually go on to say why it's difficult, therefore I think there's a good chance that's going to be one of your questions. It goes on to talk about the case of Japan's lost decade, talking about the assumptions about future economic growth are at best a guess. And then it's got this interesting data down here, and it's basically saying that Standard Chartered predict China's growth will be up to 73 trillion, whereas PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, reckon it'll be 25 trillion. So there's a 300% difference there. And if you have a look over here, what you'll see, this is yet another prediction for the size of future economies. This is looking for 2050, and this is saying 50 by 2050, 25 by 2030. So it'd be interesting to know whether this was the PricewaterhouseCoopers stuff or not. Now, before we go on any further, it's probably worth having a think about this lost decade. So let's have a look at that in a little bit more detail. Now, Japan's lost decade, or actually it might be better to call it decades, basically starts in 1990 and goes from 1990 to 2000, although some experts actually put it from 1990 all the way through to 2010 and beyond. And if you have a look, it's quite interesting to look at that fact there. Up until 1991, basically growth had been going at a massively fast rate, something like 6-7%. Now, if you think about it, that's not far off where China is at the moment. However, since 1991, since that sort of 1990 period, 0.1. Absolutely, effectively no growth whatsoever. And in fact, this period is one which is known as the lost decades, and is a period of what's called stagflation. It's worth, you don't need to be an expert on this, but it's worth looking at what actually happened. And basically, what was happening in the run-up to 1990, 1991 was that people just believed that this was an economic miracle and was going to keep on happening. Government deregulation was going on, banks were lending vast amounts of money, and in particular, much of that money was going out in poor quality loans. Loans that in reflection were unlikely to be paid back. In 1989, 1990, around this period here, the bubble bursts. There's a financial crisis. Basically, suddenly all of these banks find out that they haven't actually got the finances to cope with the bad debts that they've got. To survive, they basically borrow money from the Japanese government. Japanese government, therefore, is pumping money into these banks. These banks, in return, are trying to get their books to balance, so they basically have to now reduce their loans. By reducing their loans, money isn't going into business. At the same time, businesses, they've also been hit by this. They don't want to actually take out any more loans, so they're not investing. So during this period, you have a massive period of time where there's very little, if no investment going on. Companies then aren't expanding, which means that often many companies are going bankrupt, people are being made unemployed, and you have a negative multiplier effect going on for the whole of this period. In fact, during this period, there are 3 economic recessions that happen. This period of zero growth, low inflation, like I say, it's called stagflation, could possibly be a model for China. And if you do a bit of research, what you'll see is that the same sort of economic conditions that are happening in Japan are happening in China at the moment. There's been this massive increase in GDP. There's been vast amounts of possibly poor quality loans being made. And in fact, some estimates say that there is $1 trillion, which is roughly equivalent to the same amount of Britain's GDP in 1 year. So a massive amount of money. There's $1 trillion in poor quality loans being made within the Chinese economy. There's certainly a housing bubble there. Massive buildings basically been built. No one can really afford them. So you could argue that there's a perfect preconditions for a sort of lost decade. And that's going to be important if that's the question that comes up. Now, coming back to this page, it's worth thinking about View 4. View 4 is quite interesting. It talks about the reasons why they were able to grow their economy so fast, China in particular. So if you have a look here, you can see the sort of capitalist reforms, massive amounts of resources, modernising the economy, massive investment, all under this concept of state capitalism. But it then goes on to say that basically there are some problems. Okay, it sort of suggests a little bit perhaps of corruption. It highlights the fact that actually there isn't this young sort of working population anymore, and that China is the greatest, fastest, most rapidly aging population. So there are some real issues here. It also talks about how actually it's got to change its model. And one of the things is that actually China is slowly trying to change. And it's trying to change from a model which is based on cheap exports to one which is based on a domestic market. And if it can pull that trick off, then actually there's good reason to suggest that it can actually grow substantially. On the other hand, if it can't actually start creating its own internal market and selling things to Chinese, then it's hard to see how it can carry on with this sort of rapid economic growth. So some really interesting ideas here that you can look at and explore. Now, for both countries, if they're going to actually continue to grow economically, then it's quite likely that they're going to have to rely on FDI, foreign direct investment. And what's interesting here is that there's a big difference here between the two countries. So figure 5 is quite interesting. What you can actually see is that in most situations, actually, China is better off than India in terms of helping set up a business. Okay, enforcing contracts is pretty damn good. Okay, trading across borders, it's got the infrastructure, it's got the ports. Paying taxes, well, maybe not as good as America, but better than India. A couple of places, though, it's the same as India. Electricity, okay, generally speaking, not so good, which is surprising, but again, perhaps it highlights some of the regional differences in China. I imagine on the East Coast, much easier than in the West. Starting a business is remarkably hard, actually. So there are still challenges here that will actually reduce the amount of investment coming into China. Now, there's also, again, government policies. So we've already talked about, in previous videos, these state-owned enterprises. These are serious issues in terms of government expenditure and government policy. If you think 155,000 businesses, and you think that each one of those may easily be employing a couple of thousand people, well, you're starting to talk about millions of jobs that are actually dependent on these state-owned enterprises. Most of them are inefficient. Most of them, okay, will actually have some of that poor quality debt that we were talking about in the previous slides. What China does with these is quite an interesting question, most analysts think that this is actually going to be a real problem for China in the future. India, on the other hand, far fewer state-owned companies. Talks about a few hundred by the national government and 800 owned by state government. That's still substantially more than Britain, but nowhere near the same scale as China. What is interesting, though, is that both India and China have got government policies which affect, again, inward investment. Actually, in India, they're quite protectionist. Basically, government policies designed to stop foreign companies coming in and outcompeting local business. And again, we've talked about in the past what a neoliberalist view would have on that, and basically, it's someone who believed in neoliberalism would be disgusted by it. It's basically not good. Okay, it means that you're actually protecting inefficient businesses. On the other hand, okay, China's got an interesting idea, which is that basically if companies want to invest, they have to partner up with a Chinese company. Now, this probably explains over here why starting a business is actually doing so badly. So on one hand, it's a bad idea, it's reducing the amount of investment. But on the other hand, this has been quite clever. It basically means that when companies want to invest and build relatively high-tech industries, they have to do it in partnership, and that speeds up technological transfer. So this has actually been quite a successful policy by the Chinese to actually speed up technological transfer, at the cost possibly of putting businesses off. So pluses and minuses. Now, as we were talking about a second ago, when we're talking about government policies, it's worth casting a sort of neoliberal eye over them, and I'll let you, if you want, pause and read through that information on the left-hand side. What I am interested here are the sort of opportunities, if you like, and threats from government spending. So, if we look at China, China is basically investing heavily in education. Investing in education, more educated workforce, huge expenditure, for example, on teaching people to speak English, means that you're moving towards an educated, high qualified workforce which is able to work more and more in the tertiary and even quaternary sector. By developing English, you're able to actually trade more effectively on a national, global scale. So actually, that's providing a real opportunity for China to actually become global and develop its business and its industry. India, less so, but does have an advantage of more people speaking English as a second language, I suppose. Infrastructure expenditure, we'll talk about in a second. Well, actually, that's a real challenge for India in particular. One of the views we'll look at talks about this as being a major brake on their economic growth. For China, infrastructure has actually been used pretty much as a pump primer to actually drive forwards economic development, and by spending on this, it's created positive multiplier effects and enabled them to actually attract more FDI. So real advantages there. One thing which, again, we've talked about, comes back to those neoliberal views, is what is India going to do about these subsidies, these pro-poor policies. If it keeps the pro-poor policies, then that's supporting millions of people in real need. But those subsidies, those tariffs, those protectionist policies, they are going to limit its role on the global scale. It's also incredibly expensive. You're talking about 15% of government spending, when this is a government which has got to invest more in roads, in ports, electricity, education even. So there's a real challenge here about whether this can actually be kept up and whether that needs to be removed. And again, if it's removed, it's the poor that suffers. So again, there's a serious sort of consequence there that needs to be explored. And if we look at these parts of the resource booklet, what we'll actually see is it's just reinforcing that sort of pattern, that sort of point about India not having the infrastructure to actually become part of, well, as you can see here, this sort of modern economies. And just an interesting idea, it talks about this just-in-time supply chain. This is very much a Japanese idea from the 1980s, which basically required you to have absolute brilliant infrastructure so that you didn't have to have huge stockpiles of coal or metals or things like that. That the coal, the metal would arrive on the day that you actually needed it. Well, with the poor infrastructure that India has got, just not something that's going to happen. Whereas you can see over here, with the massive expenditure in terms of China's infrastructure, that's something increasingly they're able to do. Now, another factor which is going to affect economic progress is the quality, if you like, of the workforce available. Again, if we come back to this data, this is using the Social Progress Index data. What's clear is that pretty much every single count, actually, China does better than India. Whether it be the sort of basic human needs, whether it be linked to the foundations of well-being, in particular basic knowledge, information communications, or whether it's about access to advanced education, or even freedom of choice. Actually, in all of these issues, China has a more educated, a healthier, and in many ways a happier, more equal society from which to draw its labour pool. And in particular, the idea of being healthier and more educated suggests that in the long term, China has a better workforce, a higher quality workforce from which to make economic development. The only one area actually where India does almost as well in those things is access to information communication, and that then links to the idea of India being well placed in terms of developing its tertiary and quaternary industries. So again, there are some interesting issues here about how China and India are going to do in the future, which you might want to think about. Now, one of the reasons why China in particular, and to a lesser extent India, have managed to grow so rapidly is the relative political stability within the country. Now, we've talked in the last couple of videos about the idea that modernists argue that as a country develops, it becomes not only more economically developed, but also socially and politically more developed. And for modernists, that means more like America. And we've also mentioned in the past the guy called Parsons. Now, his argument is that as a country moves through Rostow stages and becomes more economically developed, the political development has to follow. And it's fair to argue, therefore, that with the increasing wealth, no other country in Southeast Asia has got worse democracy scores than China, that actually that would have to improve substantially. That then leads to conflict possibly between the Communist Party and the rising middle classes in China, and if you have internal conflict, that's likely to affect the rates of economic growth. So again, another unknown, another sort of possible threat to their economic development. Now, a major factor affecting both India and China is demographics. And there's two bits of data here that we can look at. First of all, we can look at the total projections. And if we have a look, we can see there's two distinct patterns. China peaking somewhere between 2020 and 2030 and then population declining, whereas India's population set to overtake China by 2030 and continues growing way into 2050 and beyond. We can also see that we can look at what's called the population dependency ratio. Now, the formula for this is down here. Slightly complicated. It's worth just actually playing around with this yourself and doing it. Now, normally it's uses young dependence, which is normally defined as 0 to 16. Here it's defined as 0 to 19, but we can live with that, and over 65s. And to calculate this, what you do is you add up the total number of dependents. Okay, so that would be 37.4 plus 5.9. And that would give you a figure of 43.3%. So that's the total population of dependents. Now, if you work that out, what you can then see is that by 43.3% of the population of dependents, well, out of 100, that means 56% or 56.7% have to be of working age, economically active. Times that by 100 and that gives you the dependency ratio. And you can see here, I've calculated the numbers here. And they show you quite an interesting pattern. At the moment, India actually suffers from having a huge number, over a third of its population under the age of 19. So it's got a large number of young dependents which basically are either economically inactive going to school, university, or possibly working, but won't be earning very much. China, on the other hand, has far fewer young people. Its one-child policy means that actually less than a quarter of its population is aged under 19. It does, however, have a significant problem, because China has got the most rapidly ageing population in the world, and we can see by 2050 that it's gone from being sort of under 20% to over a quarter of all the population will be over 65, and that pattern is likely to increase with time. That presents lots of problems. It means that there's a large number of people now no longer working in the workforce. That huge swathe of young, economically active, cheap labour that China was using to build its economy on would have disappeared. It means the government will have to spend substantially more on healthcare and on old people's homes and support for the aged as well. The only plus side, I suppose, and again there's a synoptic link here, is that does this mean that there will be a sort of Chinese equivalent of the grey pound? And that's a moot point, because remember, you're not talking here about affluent baby boomers. We're talking here about people that have grown up with China becoming a rapidly developing country but not a developed country. India's pattern is slightly different. It actually starts with this horrifically high dependency ratio. 76.3% makes it one of the highest in the world, certainly for a developing country. But the good news is that with greater education, access to contraception, etc., the birth rate is actually falling. And what we actually see is that there's therefore a decline in the young population. There is, because health improving, etc., an increase in the old population, but not as marked as we're seeing in China, and it's also made up for the fall here in young population. So what we actually see in India is an improving dependency ratio. And in fact, by 2050, you'll actually see that India has the better dependency ratio than China. So in that sense, the long-term problems here are China's. India is going to be benefiting from this demographic dividend that China had in the 1990s. Now, one of the biggest threats facing India and China is the consumption of resources. We can see, just looking at this graph, and bearing in mind it's 2010, we can see that India and China are massive consumers of raw materials. So 48 or so percent of rice, significant users of timber. China in particular, a massive consumer of meat. Notice India isn't there. Coal and steel. Now India is less significant than China on practically all of these except timber, where it's the same. What's interesting is that we then think about what's going to happen in the future. Well, future, if you look, just food demand set to increase by 70 to 100%. That's partly due to population increase. Well, we know India in particular is facing a population increase, but also this idea of nutritional transition. This is the idea that as people become richer and become more developed, they tend to have more meat in their diet, they're more likely to have processed foods in their diet, more likely to have a Western diet. And with that comes more food being consumed, more meat, which requires far more land than vegetables and rice, and health effects, diabetes, heart disease, etc. Now, the issue here is, can actually food supply be set up to manage that increase in population and that nutritional transition? If it can, then great, these countries can carry on developing. If it can't, then China and India, with their growing populations, increasing industrial pollution, issues about their own farm productivity, deforestation, desertification, etc., can they actually meet that needs? And if not, will that actually slow down their economic growth? So there's a real issue there. Now there are other issues here as well. So fresh water, for example, if we have a look, okay, what we can see is that most of the fresh water is actually used for food. Well, that's probably true in China and India as well. In these cases, very vulnerable. They're dependent on monsoons, on snowmelt, and basically 3 or 4 major rivers. Most of these are transnational and transboundary rivers. They go into other nations as well. Question then is, with growing population, growing food demands, can that fresh water actually be used effectively? Now there's a technological fix issue here. If you have a look, okay, It says farming accounts for 70% of fresh water demand worldwide, 90% in developing countries. The implication here is that water can be used more effectively with better technology. If there's investment in that technology, then actually that transition can be managed. If not, water scarcity is going to be a major issue. It's going to hold back both countries. Other factors, for example, global metal trade, energy, okay, these are all issues of scarcity. And again, there's a question here about how much energy can these countries actually use? Can they create renewables, for example? We know China is the largest producer of solar panels in the world. We know they've built the Three Gorges Dam, so they're certainly heading that way towards being able to do it, but can that keep up with their demand? Also, there's issues such as peak oil here and predicting when peak oil is going to happen. These are all issues that can come into some sort of discussion into this sort of section about resource consumption and use. It's worth thinking that at the moment, you're really dealing with record low prices of oil, Saudi Arabia producing far more oil than the market can consume. Is that going to carry on? So again, is there an oil shock in the pipeline, if you pardon the pun, that's going to really hit these countries quite hard? One thing that is worth thinking about in terms of oil in particular, and affects India more than China, is pathways. India doesn't really have any sort of neighbours with large amounts of oil reserves. China has actually built a pipeline network to Siberia in Russia. Now, again, you want to be synoptic there. You can think about Russia using oil as a geopolitical weapon, as it's done, for example, in Ukraine. But it does actually mean it's not dependent on huge oil tankers bringing in oil from the Gulf quite the same way that perhaps China is. So again, some real issues there that need to be considered. Now, the final issue I want to consider is that of climate change. We've already looked at the issues about China increasing the amount of CO2, India slightly increasing. But the whole point, the bigger issue here, is that this is global scale pollution. So we need to look at the overall global total trend. And that, I'm afraid, is not looking good. If you look, what we're actually talking about is something in the region of, well, 30% increase in CO2 outputs by 2030. If that's the case, then it's quite likely there's going to be substantial climate change. And again, if you look at figure 14, we can see that the predictions, and this is only one possible model, is that India in particular will suffer horrendously from this. But this is only temperature. You've also got to think about rainfall, factors such as El Nino and other sort of snow melt, ice melt, all very complicated patterns. It's not just going to be temperature. It might be increased number of natural hazards such as typhoons and cyclones, for example. So the picture does not look good. Now, if this is the case, this is going to have massive issues in terms of biodiversity, water security. Remember that you've got the Ganges down here, you've got various major rivers flowing from the Himalayas through China, Yellow River, for example, Yangtze. These are all fed by monsoon and snowmelt in the Himalayas. If you have changing climate, if you have massive increase in temperature, the flow regime of those rivers is going to change. Water security is going to be a major issue. So even though China itself may not be the worst affected, what goes on in the Himalayas will affect it. Question is whether these countries can actually adapt for climate change. Do they have the capacity to actually cope with this rapidly changing weather? Again, you would argue possibly China, with its higher GDP and perhaps slightly more efficient sort of government, might be able to, but it's going to struggle, let's be honest. India, I'm not so sure it's even such a good place. There's a real issue here. Rural poverty, lower GDP, there's big issues here. We know that it's got large rural population dependent on agriculture, lots of small farmers. Will they actually have the ability to cope? I'm not so sure. So it's a real issue here again. It's going to affect both of them badly, but you could argue India worse than China. So let's come into the end of this video now. So we've looked at the different reasons why these countries have got some opportunities, quite a few threats. Actually, if you think about it, It's quite interesting that there's quite a bit of difference between India and China, and at the top end of your answers, if you're going for the A's, the A stars, you really want to be able to pick those out. Now, I hope this has been helpful. Please feel free to use this video, use it to complete your notes, use it to have a go at some of the questions we suggested at the beginning. So a typical question might be, what are the opportunities and threats facing the growth of India and China? Or why is predicting the growth of India and China, or probably China, so hard to do? Have a go at those questions. Feel free to show them to me. And hopefully you should be quite confident going into the exams. But good luck, and thanks ever so much.